created informed citizenry, MMA, over the last 23 years developed a program called Bonabana, which is in Sesotho means see the children, and really highlighting the urgent need for media, for government, for civil society, and big tech to really prioritize and advance children's digital rights in the media. And this, I think that's the conversation, that's part of the conversation that includes me in terms of understanding how digital harms affect young people and the kind of innovative ideas that we can come up to solve or address issues of digital harm and digital harms that young people face.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Thobekile Matimbe, and I work for an organization called Paradigm Initiative, which is an organization that works across the African continent promoting digital rights and digital inclusion. So in the context of today's conversation, I think we'll be talking about how to center the rights of those who are displaced and refugees, asylum seekers, etc. But just to see how their digital rights are also promoted and protected is something of key interest to us.
Hi everyone, my name is Wuraola Taiwo. I work with an organization called Co-Creation Hub, where we harness the power of technology to promote Africa's prosperity. I'm with the technology and society practice, and basically what we do is sit somewhere in between the threats and opportunities of tech on Africans, while I may not be speaking directly to protection of refugees. We've done a lot of work with media, particularly journalists, and digital security and data protection for journalists. So I guess that's also a theme that we'll be exploring during this panel session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all. So Caleb, if I could start with you. Could you describe for us BuildUp's approach to digital resilience and strengthening information integrity, and provide some examples of your work in displacement contexts?
Great. So we approach it in two particular ways. So the first way is also similar to what you guys are doing in terms of understanding the problem. And one thing we've realized is when communities migrate or leave their own communities and go into new ones, sometimes they're not welcomed. And what we see in these spaces is narratives and themes that do not either work to include them and integrate with them. And we first try to understand how are they being received. So if you have South Sudanese coming into Kenya, if you have Zimbabweans going into South Africa, if you have, Nigerians going into Nigeria, we're trying to understand that migration, what does it look like, and how do people receive it? And by that, we look at narratives online. So that's the first thing, understanding the problem. And by one of the things we have is we've built a social media monitoring tool from the ground up that allows people to look into those spaces, gather the data, and try to understand what are the key narratives we are seeing that are either problematic and need to be addressed, or we need to figure out how are people feeling about the fact that we have an influx of refugees coming into our country. So that's the first narrative analysis. But then and then beyond that, once we get that analysis, the first thing is to try and work with communities, especially where we're seeing areas of exclusion. Sometimes we see a lot of hate narratives against refugees, and we try to work with local peace building organizations to try and build this culture of cohesion, to show these are also humans who are moving from other points of conflict that also just need care and all these other elements that communities benefit from. So then the second bit is the understanding that refugees by themselves also get to participate in conversations of development, and they're not seen as outsiders. So, and what this means is, as the fact that they're fleeing their country does not mean that they've left everything behind and don't care about their own context, but also want to participate so that they can be able to go back. And I'll give you a clear example. For instance, in countries where there's conflict or war, we've seen refugees sometimes being excluded in peace processes. Why? Because you have people who are within the country wanting to advance these agreements of peace, but then ignoring the fact that there are also refugees who are outside the country and they also want to participate in these processes because they still want to go back. So we've also developed deliberative tools that enable people who are outside their countries to be able to participate and raise their voices and say, this is what we want for us to be able to come back. These are our demands, these are things that we think are of importance to us, because currently we are in that refugee status, we are not home. So being able to first understand the problem where the communities are migrating to, that's the first step. And then the second step is being able to give them the tools necessary for them to participate in processes that allow them to have a voice in areas of development in the countries of origin, or being able to have a voice in the peace processes, especially when the country is in conflict. So we've done this in Sudan, we've done this in Ethiopia, we've done this in Somalia, and areas where you're seeing a lot of communities fleeing and going into other jurisdictions. We're trying to identify where are they, how can we gather their voices and include their ideas back into conversations that are happening in the country. And it's interesting because a lot of the processes when they happen in country assume that, okay, they've left, so they are no longer interested. Like just the fact of leaving is a symbol of we're no longer interested in being part of these conversations. But once you offer them these tools, you actually find that you'll see this a lot on social media, where you have a lot of narratives that are generated outside the country influencing a lot of activities that are happening inside the country. So then we try to harness that into, can this be a process that can actually help push for peace process, a change and development. So those two areas where we work, and all these are driven by tech, and happy to have a conversation with you. We have a stand, for example, in just explaining how that tool that does social media monitoring looks like, so that you can think of it even if you're trying to engage with different communities. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Caleb. If I could ask a follow-up, how does, practically speaking, that engagement with those peace-building process work? How do you engage with these refugees? And then also, have you seen, or through Phoenix, have you been able to see narratives around that engagement from non-refugee communities? I mean, and their feelings on that.
So the way we do the engagement is when we look at, like most of you on social media, right? So when we look at social media, we think of it in terms of not just narratives, but also location and geolocation. So if you have, let's say, a big community of Namibians who live in another jurisdiction, let's say, like, I don't know, they live in South Africa, and they have a community by themselves, what we usually first see is people start to form groups and pages and accounts that are trying to almost build a community outside their own jurisdiction. So first we try to identify how do those communities show up in digital spaces? So that's the first thing. And then the second point is what type of conversations are they having? And they're usually like outside in, as opposed to inside in, meaning that there are people who are talking from the outside saying this is what we would like, this is what we want to see in our country, as opposed to this is what's currently happening now. So with Phoenix, like this social media monitoring tool, if you have, for instance, location markers in your conversation, let's say you talk about Namibia, or you have in your profile, you say that you live in a particular country, we're able to gather that information. So I'll give you an example. A lot of Ethiopians live in Washington, D.C., and they work as Uber drivers, right? And they have a huge community online. And they fled because there's a lot of conflict that's currently happening in Tigray. So once we tap that conversation, we tap that network, then we can open channels of conversation and say, hey, this is what we are seeing. You're already engaging on this platform. Are you interested in being part of a national dialogue, right? If they agree, because this is something that they also have to agree, then we provide them with a tool that then that dialogue starts to raise questions to them about what they'd like to see in their own country. This is, we don't do it face-to-face just because of the fact that, the refugees are scattered across different countries. But we try to identify where these pockets are and see if local organizations in their home countries can now reach to them and talk to them either face-to-face. But the first phase is trying to understand these tools, the narratives with tech tools, and then offer spaces for them to engage where they don't feel like they're especially seen as outsiders, seen as deserters, especially in conflict. And that is what we've seen on social media. When they try to engage on social media, people will say, oh, you left us. So why do you have a voice? Why do you care? So these other platforms are completely anonymous and allow for this level of deliberation. And we're now seeing a lot of deliberative tools in different processes outside just even refugee engagement.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Phakamile, if I could turn to you next. So following up on Caleb's points, could you provide some background on Media Monitoring Africa's approach to strengthening digital resilience and information integrity, and specifically in the South African context and anti-foreigner sentiment?
Thank you so much, Chris. Firstly, Caleb, wonderful work that you guys are doing. Amazing. We have a slightly different approach in the sense that when we work with our young people and our digital and media literacy training are really, the core is really to address some of the issues around anti-foreigner sentiments that young people have. And we do this through a project. Can you go to the next slide? We do this through a project that is supported by Innovation Norway. You can go to the next slide. And the name of the project is Information Integrity Pilot Project in South Africa, really to promote Ubuntu values through pre-banking. So we use the pre-banking strategy to address and confront and pre-bank or debunk anti-foreigner narratives with young people especially. The partnerships, it's a multi-stakeholder approach. As you know, when you're dealing with young people, it really takes a village to raise a young person or to effect change with young people. And so we do it with our Department of Basic Education, Department of Justice, and as well as the Technical Advisory Group from the UNHCR, as well as Health Advisory leading the process, leading the pilot project with our support, and as well as the UNHCR. The target audience for this particular project is South African learners between the ages of 14 to 17. We've done work across 3 provinces, Gauteng, Limpopo, and KZN. Again, this is a pilot project. We want to see how the pre-banking messaging impacts young people, how it lands with young people, and then should it be something that young people are interested in, then we hope to scale. And really the core mission is to promote Ubuntu values. And to start to unpack and to have really tough discussions with young people around intolerance, inequality, discrimination, and how in their little corners they can start to confront and combat anti-foreigner sentiments in the country. As everybody knows here, South Africa is infamous for xenophobic attacks, and that has an impact on young people and how they see others in their daily lives. Thank you. We can move on to the next slide. So a little bit about pre-banking. So pre-banking essentially is really a proactive strategy that is aimed at equipping, we say learners and teachers here, but it's really equipping anyone with the knowledge to be able to identify, understand, and counter disinformation, misinformation, and negative stereotypes, particularly around, pre-banking can be used with any issue. We use it for combating anti-foreigner narratives in the country. And it's in 2 parts. One is the issue-based pre-banking, where we address specific harmful narratives, and you'll see in the later slides, where so there's a lot of stereotypes that are going around foreign nationals. One of them is that foreigners are criminals, right? So we will address the specific harmful narrative and then directly counter those xenophobic stereotypes affecting refugee communities. And then lastly is build actual factual understanding of displacement realities for foreigners and foreign national children. The second one is, which is long-term, is like the logic-based pre-banking, where it teaches recognition of manipulative tactics, identifies scapegoating and fear-mongering, but also develops critical thinking around it develops critical thinking in the sense that you become very cautious of messaging, especially on social media, around what you consume, what young people consume, and how they consume it, and how it impacts their lives. So that building of critical thinking skills that I'll talk about later. Thank you. Before we get to the actual project and the product of how we do the pre-banking, the objectives here is that we want to build empathy, allowing players, and we do it through a game called Mzansi Life, and you'll see I have a little snapshot of the game, where we embed the pre-banking within the game, where young people engage in the game and then they get to understand some of the issues. And the key objective again, building empathy, allowing players to walk in the shoes of others, and you'll see, and I'll explain a little bit about that. And then players being then able to encounter a series of pre-banking messages via the random event cards that they will get. It's like, if you've played Monopoly, then you will understand the game. And then also just embedding the game on the intervention, the very hard and hard topic of foreign nationals in the country like South Africa, which has a lot of xenophobic incidences, attacks. Embedding the game, embedding the topic within like a play form, so you're creating an environment that is generally relaxed and young people are able to engage. And then also modeling positive social behavior. The game rewards positive social behavior by allocating Mzansi points, again I'll show you, where characters cooperate, help each other and stand up for each other. And the last one is really balancing realism and optimism, in the sense that we want to strike a positive balance tone while acknowledging the very hard topics of intolerance, inequality and discrimination, and often the kind of social violence that comes from that. So this is the game, Mzansi Life board game. So it's a board game. From my side, it's the far right would be where you start off. It's called your early life. So learners get a future card, get a life card that is very. It's the start of the game. Sorry, I can't. It's the start of the game in your far right. Where learners start off the game, and they start off very differently. So the start life card will say, I'm Phakamile and I'm from DRC and I moved to South Africa because of conflict. Another card will say, hi, I'm Chris, I've lived here all my life. So it really exposes young people to different backgrounds, right? And they all start at the same place, in their early life, and then they go to school, and then at the end there is the finish. And in between that you get your event cards, which are then kind of unpacking all the different issues that you will come across, that all learners will come across as they go through life. So the event card on the other side says, so for example, this is an example of an event card and how the pre-bunking is embedded in the game itself. So we have your microdose, you have your warning, and then you have your refutation. So the story goes, you shared a fake story. This WhatsApp says foreign spazas are selling poison. So I can't even see that. I'm sure you also can't even see that. Let me get up. So I'll read it for you. Wow, my eyes are. The WhatsApp says, maybe I'll read from this side. Yeah. So it says, you shared a fake story. This WhatsApp says foreign spazas are putting poison in cold drinks, which is something that it's absurd to me and you, but it happens a lot in South Africa. Where the target are foreign national spaza shops. And then it says, make sure so that's the microdose, right? They're saying you put foreign nationals are putting poison in the cold drinks. That's the microdose, right, of the xenophobic talk or narrative. And then the warning says, make sure you don't get tricked by social media posts which spread false rumors about foreigners. Sharing fake, and then the refutation says, sharing fake information hurts everyone and makes people suspicious of each other. And then it says, skip a turn, right? And on the other end, so this would be if you are the culprit that's sharing this information. Then the other 10 is when you are the victim. It says, you get tricked by a fake message claiming that spaza shop food is toxic. Again, the microdose, right? And then the warning says, watch out for messages that use emotional language to make you scared or angry. These can be a tactic to try to spread false information and give lots of viewers, right? Then skip a turn. So as you start off your life and you walk through the journey of the game, you will encounter a lot of these event cards. And the idea is to, again, give you a microdose, but then give you a warning, and then give you some factual understanding of the situation so that you start to have some critical thinking as you engage with social media to say, actually, this might not be true. I need to start thinking more critically about these issues and not just consuming information. So, how does this help South African children, and hopefully how does the game, what lessons can we take from the game? It strengthens social cohesion, so building empathy and inclusion among young South Africans. We've seen this where we've done pilot consultations with learners in Gauteng, Limpopo, and Northwest, where young people, after playing the game, have a lot of questions to ask, but also they start to have critical thinking around, actually, I shouldn't be I shouldn't just be consuming information online without kind of having some critical background to it, doing more investigation, doing research, but also just having empathy, which I think is an important building block when we talk about building digital resilience, and putting yourself in other people's shoes and trying to understand the situation. It also increases informed advocates for refugee rights, because now young people are then saying, actually, some of the stuff that I'm reading about foreign nationals are not true, and then they start to think about similarities rather than differences. Preventing harm escalation addresses narratives before they fuel hate speech and violence, and we've seen this even with young people. And a lot of the young people that we engage with in the consultation often say that some of the things that I'm getting about foreign nationals, I actually don't, I'm getting it from home. My parents are the ones that are saying these things, and I'm learning it from home, which kind of talks to the deeper issues that we often find ourselves when dealing with digital harms. So it's not just something that happens online, but it stems from somewhere deeper, right? And we do have young people that kind of have a differing viewpoint from their parents or from their schools or from their teachers to say, after having gone through the game and the discussions after the game, I'm leaning towards being open-minded about foreign nationals and being more welcoming, which is really what we want, because that's going to prevent harm. And some last points around a scalable model for Africa. I think it does demonstrate community-based approaches to information integrity. It can be the start of helping young people understand what kind of information to consume, and the processes that they need to ensure that the information that they are engaging with on social media has a level of integrity and is credible. And also provides framework that can be adaptable to other African communities. Like I said, we're still in the piloting stages, but we've gotten really good feedback from young people. Again, this game is like the 5th iteration, where every time we consult, we get more views and more feedback from young people about the game and potential uses of the game. And so we really hope that it's something that we can distribute to all schools in South Africa to really combat anti-foreigner narratives in the country. Yeah. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you so much, Phakamile. If I could ask a quick follow-up, what is the thought process behind maybe a board game versus, as we're talking about digital issues versus something online? Are there plans to maybe potentially digitize this, or I know you talked about scalability, but it would be interesting to hear about that.
Thank you so much, Chris. So in initial discussions, there is an online game that we are planning. But what we found from young people is that actually when we do the consultations, it's more beneficial. So we've done 2 consultations where we just say, hi, here, this is who we are, please play the game. And then we've done a consultation where we first come and address issues and talk about issues, have a facilitated session with young people around anti-foreigner narratives, around why do they see it, how do they see it, where do they see it, and how does it make them feel as young people in the country. And then they play the game. And then we found that when there is a facilitated session, it has a better outcome for young people. But there is going to be a game option for especially speaking to scalability. But we hope that, because again, like I said, these issues of digital harms don't just happen online, they stem from somewhere. And again, for young people, it's really important that when you're dealing with, even with cyberbullying, gender-based violence, they all stem from somewhere. So a facilitated session always helps to unpack some of those issues, and also gives the opportunity to the young person to ask questions more than anything, to better understand the situation. So we've often gotten responses where young people are like, what is conflict? I don't even understand when they say they're running from conflict. Like, what is that? And we have to explain and show pictures and show videos on YouTube to say, this is the situation. And then, again, builds empathy. To say, oh my gosh, I really didn't understand the situation, you know? So even though there is going to be an online game, we find that a physical, and I know it sounds like it's defeating the purpose, but it's trying to unpack and address several issues at one.
Thank you so much. And from UNHCR's perspective, I think we recognize that it's a whole society problem. We need a whole society approach. We need digital rights organizations, private sector, governments, and so this project works really well, and we're very proud of it. So Thobekile, I think turn to you next. So we've heard about skill building, technical capacity, but would you be able to speak a bit about the policy side, governance? How would this look if we're trying to build digital resilience? and provide some background on Paradigm's initiative work within forcibly displaced and stateless contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as I introduced myself and my organization earlier, our priority is digital rights, so across a wide range of human rights issues. And when we come to the conversation on statelessness, forcibly displaced persons, we also try and locate digital rights in that conversation, and at least to address some of the adverse impacts of human rights violations. So when you're looking at the conversation of information and information integrity around refugees, forcibly displaced persons, stateless people generally, what we see is that misinformation, disinformation results in categorization of this group of people as criminals. And I think we just heard that from the previous speaker talking about that. But refugees, they are not criminals. They are human beings with human dignity as a fundamental right. And that needs to be upheld, that needs to be promoted, that needs to be protected. So how can that happen? When you look at, for instance, in the context of elections, and we're talking about information disorders, we say that election management bodies have a role to ensure that they feed the system, the ecosystem, with correct information so that there's no misinformation and disinformation, at least to reduce that happening. In the same vein, we need to see intentionality from government to ensure that they bring that awareness, bring that information that refugees are not criminals. Because outside of that, I know for a fact, having worked a lot in the legal space, in the digital rights space as well, that in the legal space, anybody who would be brought even to courts, there's this heightened, security around refugees, etc. There's this kind of impression that this is a very odd group of people that have committed a crime, but that is not the case. And I think trying to, do away with that, feeding the ecosystem, the information ecosystem with truth, and trying to promote protection of these groups is very important. I'll give an example of what has happened, for instance, in Malawi. There was an incident a couple of years back where, some 2 people had been killed in one community, and, the misinformation was just, all over the place that it's refugees who have done it. And you find that, police or law enforcement have a role to actually put out information that is accessible to, to the public, that is correct, to sort of, do away with that misinformation that will be circulating. So from that, you'll see that even what will have happened online can even escalate as well to offline with attacks on refugees and the likes. So it's a structural problem as far as I'm concerned around, feeding the wrong or not even feeding the wrong information online, or not even countering wrong information online from the government. And governments have a first primary obligation to ensure that fundamental rights and freedoms are upheld. So as Paradigm Initiative, I think one of the key functions is to promote right policies and right legislative frameworks that ensure that rights are respected online or through the use of digital technologies. And when you look at the conversation we are having today, I think one of the primary issues as well that we see is the failure of legislation to adequately provide for the rights of refugees. Even if we were to look at, for instance, data protection legislation that is there, we don't have adequate, particularization of the rights of refugees. Right now we have data protection legislation that have kind of also featured, and cybersecurity legislation as well, that has kind of featured the rights of children, but not necessarily to particularize and give adequate protections for the rights of refugees in the context of their data. And I think that's also what then escalates on social media platforms or in data breaches that can happen as well, that people's identity might be disclosed. But sometimes as well, the challenge that we're having with stateless people is that there's no adequate frameworks that provide for their access to services, access to financial services, access to resources that they need. So you'd find that some countries, of course, don't allow for them to get access to SIM cards or access to financial accounts, etc. So you find that this group of people naturally are marginalized, left at the fringes of economic empowerment, economic sustenance. So that in itself is a problem for refugees and for those who are forcibly displaced, and it's a major concern for us. It's also another structural problem. So what we need to see are policies that ensure that refugees are able to access financial services, online financial services as well. In countries like Kenya and Uganda, there's been sort of efforts to come up with some form of system that allows for refugees, for instance, to be able to access resources through the use of things like barcodes and, giving them sort of access to financial services. There's also this disconnect between rural and urban settings where we see that especially those in the rural areas who are refugees, they are left out and cut out of meaningful connectivity. So they are not able to actually be included, to be online, to be able to even counter the narratives that are out there, to even tell their stories online. It's so empowering. It gives urgency when you are able to, as a human being, to be able to counter your own narrative by telling your story and putting your voice out there. I know that there are organizations, humanitarian organizations, that will run with the rights of refugees. But when we're talking about human rights, individuals need to have their own personal agency to demand accountability, to demand solutions, even to, just counter narratives that are out there by just putting their voices and featuring their voices, centering their voices online. But digital exclusion for that group of people is the major problem, and I think policy should be able to also ensure that they are not digitally excluded, to ensure that they have meaningful connectivity. They are also included even in policy, development as well, that ensures that their rights are safeguarded. Statelessness, when you look at it as well, you'll see that when you're looking at some of the ways it translates or it is experienced at national level, you'd find that even sometimes people who are not coming from across the borders, who are inside the borders, can also be rendered stateless because of the system of national identity registration, which is really not inclusive and is so burdensome that you have individuals who are failing to actually be registered as citizens within their own countries. So you'd find that policies as well and legal frameworks should be able to ensure that they simplify the process of actually getting that status as a citizen. So it's not a favor that governments are doing, but it's something that they need to do because it's something that upholds human rights. So I think in that vein, I'll just mention as well that one of the key things that we've begun to do as an organization is to ensure that we also adopt a victim-centered approach to how we engage on some of these issues. And I think, one of the key things we've done as well is to ensure that their voices are featured in some of our platforms and our forums. This year, for example, we had the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum, and we had, thanks to UNHCR, we had a group of refugees that came to the forum to be able to understand what their rights are, to be able to appreciate what digital rights are, what they have, and what they should be able to get. Among other things, digital inclusion, connectivity that is meaningful for them to be able to be online and be able to counter their narratives. And we are able to have those, great stakeholders at DRIF to be able to see and learn and not just be told by non-governmental organizations that, hey, this is what you should be getting, but to be able to experience and to strengthen their own personal agency, which is part of building digital resilience. So I think I'll just end there in terms of some of our priorities around development of policies and legislation on the continent.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask a quick follow-up, is there anywhere that you think, any country, maybe not necessarily in Africa, that could offer a bit of a guide where you see that positive framework, legal frameworks, positive policies, or at least heading in the right direction?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't really pinpoint at a specific, I shy away from giving examples of African countries on specific things for the reason that on the continent people love to copy and paste each other, and sometimes they largely do that on wrong things and wrong practices. But like I mentioned, that in the context of Kenya and Uganda, there's been a lot of strides around ensuring that there's SIM card registration for refugees, that they're able to access resources, financial resources. But you'll have countries like Sudan where you still have serious problems around that and around access to resources. In fact, when you look at data protection legislation in a country like Sudan, it's not as effective. When you look at broadly data protection legislation, they'll talk about data breaches in general. They'll talk about the data governance in the context of children, like I mentioned earlier, but still you see that legislation has really missed an opportunity to actually particularize the rights of refugees. So I wouldn't give an example because I think most of the countries where we find a lot of refugees, a lot of stateless people, there's still concerns there. But the greatest takeaway may be to be more positive. I'm sure that's the spirit of your question. I'll talk about maybe some of the efforts that humanitarian organizations themselves are doing. Even I like the fact that you guys came up with a game. And that's been able to sort of conscientize and build a good information ecosystem. And I think a lot of effort has also been put out there by humanitarian organizations, UNHCR as well. There's a lot of putting out information that can be useful to ensure that refugees their rights are respected, and even in the context of information disorders, that they are not placed at risk. So yeah, I think there's a lot of positivity from, as far as I'm concerned, more from civil society actors and humanitarian organizations that are even putting in place policies internally to also see how they can respect the rights of refugees, but not so much at government level. I think there's need to do more in terms of developing policies, especially around statelessness generally, before we even talk about online freedoms.
Thank you so much. So Wura, if I could turn to you next. So we know that many of the platforms, Facebook, Meta, Instagram, Twitter, etc., offer a lot of reporting mechanisms for individuals to report hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, etc. How far do you think these go to really strengthening digital resilience, particularly for forcibly displaced and stateless people, and what more could possibly be done?
Thank you very much for that question. I think let's just zero our minds in on the penetration of internet on the continent in particular. We've seen now that there's been a surge for the last 5 years on the use of internet in the continent. And then when we narrow it down a bit more, most of the access to internet in Africa comes from mobile devices, particularly mobile phones. And that means that people are engaging largely on social media. And beyond engaging, they're also getting information, news, narratives that shape public opinions, narratives that shape elections in some cases, narratives that might even shape conflicts in very extreme situations. Let's just go to the next slide, please. So let's see what the numbers are looking like when it comes to protection. In Africa, we've seen now from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, they carried out a research where they mapped that 40% of global disinformation campaigns target West Africa in particular. That's an interesting number because information disorders are quite rampant everywhere in the world, particularly surging after the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you look at where these disinformation campaigns are often saturated, we're looking at West Africa. Over the last couple of years as well, the UNHCR has 129.9 million people under their protection as at 2024. That's a huge number. If I'm looking at it from the population of my country, Nigeria, that's nearly half of our population, right, who are under protection as refugees, stateless persons, displaced persons. Now, I've also mentioned that 74, one of the points they mentioned in that research is that 74% of the web traffic in Africa is via mobile phones in 2024. It's also 14% higher than the world average, meaning that nearly all Africans online are accessing the internet from a mobile device. Now let's look at the real world impact of that. Misinformation and hate speech on digital platforms have there's a direct line from the harm online to physical harm in person. We've seen documented harms where, I don't know if anyone here remembers, sometime last year, Uber and Bolt had to shut down in South Africa because someone made a comment, and I don't know where the originating comment came from, but Nigerians on Twitter were quite upset. And the next thing we saw was that Nigerians were ordering Uber rides in South Africa and cancelling when they found out that the driver had gotten to the pickup destination. You have a situation like that where from Nigeria it looks like trolls are just playing a prank. But on the other side in South Africa, what we began to see was a lot of xenophobic comments towards Nigerians, which, the platforms, Uber and Bolt, basically had to shut down the apps for maybe a few hours for the day to normalize things, because a situation like that would very easily become pockets of violence on ground in South Africa. We've also seen how racism, and in Nigeria's particular context, tribalism, which was one of the tactics used by political parties in the last elections, we're still suffering the after effects of those campaigns, because people from a certain area in Nigeria, if they try to have an opinion, even when it's for the greater positive good, you have a whole faction on the other side of that narrative saying, basically discrediting what they've said because of where they're from. So I'm saying that to say that, like, digital engagement in today's world has a very real impact on how we perceive each other. So next slide, please. What are the platforms actually doing to combat this? I'll start with research that's also done by one of our favorite resources that we use in CCHub in our digital security trainings, KnowBe4. I don't know if anyone here has heard of KnowBe4, but basically it's a gamified platform where you can learn everything from digital security to concept. Awesome. Right. So we use this platform to train journalists, NGO workers, CSOs across the African continent. And last year they carried out research on voters in Africa. I think about 5 African countries were included in this research: Mauritius, Nigeria, Kenya, and I don't remember the 2 others, but basically, they try to find out what social media platforms people who vote use to consume news. And as you can see, Facebook is number 1 on that list, followed by TikTok. And I think TikTok gained that kind of popularity during the pandemic, because then people could engage with videos, very short, very impactful, easy to click, and then you have the auto scroll option where you just keep watching videos. And I think that's where the doom scrolling slang possibly came from. And then next we have Instagram, and then X and LinkedIn and other sources. So what are the critical gaps in detection of harmful information on these platforms? For Facebook and Meta platforms, they often use auto detection or automated detection. and it usually lacks cultural context. You can't ask a robot to find out if what someone in Nigeria is saying would be harmful to someone in South Africa, in Uganda, in Tanzania, for instance. In CC Hub, we try to promote something called the human in the middle approach, where if you have a platform that needs to be moderated, it's often advised that you have a person who has at least some cultural context or some safeguarding context, who is able to say that this might be harmful, maybe we should review, or this speech was shut down, but it's not necessarily harmful because this is the reason why someone has said that. And the impact on that, the impact of that lack of cultural context on meta platforms is that it's very easy for anti-refugee sentiments to go undetected, because if you don't have the trigger words that the algorithm has been trained on, then it can pick up harmful content. Next, we have TikTok. Now, because TikTok is mostly video-based, it means that people have found a way to be creative around saying things that might trigger their detection algorithms to know what is being said. We've seen where young people, sometimes it's good, because young people are able to discuss situations around like gender equity and the rest of it, or technology facilitated violence, and they're able to cover up words that would often be labeled as sensitive online. You see people saying things like grape instead of, and another risk there is that bad actors can also use, will I say, pseudonyms to promote hate speech or anti-refugee sentiment on those platforms. And because it's video-based and the speech-to-text recognition is not quite the best, most times it's trained on Global North speech. And when you have Africans on the platform who have accents that the algorithm hasn't been trained on, and that's not to say that they are doing anything wrong. It's, I mean, if the West builds a platform that's used by Africans, there is the tendency of that platform not to have some context about who we are and how we speak and how we behave. And I guess that's also to charge us to contribute as well to these platforms, because in that way you're able to improve detection of this kind of speech. Another thing that we see on the TikTok platform, or the direct impact of this gap of not being able to pick up hate speech from videos, is that the algorithm on TikTok is built for clicks. So if something seems hateful and people are engaging it, it gets promoted the most. I'll give a personal example from a security awareness video that I came across on Instagram. Basically, this user was seated beside their partner. She's female and partner male, and she saw a post that will incite rage, a rage-baiting post. And she was like, she opened the comment section and she was thinking, why are these people saying all these things about women, right? And she sends the video to her partner, who is sitting in the same room on the same network as she is. He opens the comment section and everything he sees is absolutely different from what she can see. And what that meant is some of these platforms, the comments are arranged based on the data the user has put in about themselves. And the comments are arranged in such a way that would drive more reaction from whoever is looking at the post. So she was seeing more hateful comments, while our partner was seeing comments that seemed borderline normal. And he was thinking, why are you so annoyed? I think people are countering the wrong information being passed on the post. And she's like, no, look at what I'm saying in my comments. And it was at that moment I had to adjust my lens in terms of how I consume information online and what that looks like. And I've kind of tried to also, in City Hub, we've tried to embed this knowledge into our digital security trainings. We add it to like things to look out for, particularly for journalists when they're reporting, because journalists have now been forced to also use mainstream media like social media to pass on news. And as we can see, in this particular research that was done by KnowBe4, more than half of the respondents alluded to the fact that the highest form of disinformation that they come across is on social media. But social media is still their preferred platform when it comes to receiving news. So at the end of the day, we, in the work that we do as civil society, as private sector, as educators, and as those who are trying to change the narrative for displaced persons or stateless persons or vulnerable groups in general, we also have to be aware of how consumption of media affects how people understand the message that we're trying to pass. For Twitter in particular, I would say that since the hostile takeover of the platform, right, there's been seriously reduced content moderation on the platform. And now that the platform is, you get the best out of X now if you pay for Twitter Blue, right? And in our context in Africa, it's not necessarily feasible except you make money off the platform that you pay for the premium version. And I would say that those who sponsor harmful narratives against individuals who are different, I would say different, and that includes refugees, it includes ethnic minorities, it includes vulnerable groups in terms of gender, in terms of age as well. What that means is that the content that's seen by majority of these people who don't have the premium version is not moderated. And when you don't have that kind of moderation, it's very easy for hateful narratives to be passed and to spread very widely, because it just takes one person saying some of the trigger words, or even someone saying that all people from this place are usually criminals. And the next thing you know, you have arguments, discourse for days. And then if you find, as someone who we consider vulnerable, let's say you're a woman who is an activist or a journalist, or you hold office, for instance, making a comment on that kind of discourse, even without knowing that it's a trending topic, means that there are extra risks that would come as a result of your comments. And it doesn't matter that your comment is a positive one or one that's meant to reframe the narrative. If the bucket where it drops on the timeline is the wrong one, the next thing you know, there's all these people who are doxing you, finding out where you live, where you work, and before you know it, there's someone saying, oh, this is where all those refugees live, and that's why all these crimes are happening in our area. And before you know what's going on, people are actually pulling up to that place and harming whoever that they see there. So the real time, the way misinformation spreads on these platforms, I think the number one thing that we've seen as something that increases the harm is that the platforms are not doing culturally specific or culturally conscious moderation. But let's not dwell too much on the problems. Next slide. Let's go into solutions. Now, on the platform side, would say that it's very important that the platforms invest in African language with context and cultural content moderation with cultural context training. I know that Meta had tried to do something like this with workers, with content moderators in Kenya, but unfortunately, labor exploitation kind of stalled that work. And even up till now, there's still a lot of conflict in terms of those who did the work and the work conditions that they were put under. I feel like as much as the platforms can do a lot when it comes to enhanced detection, we as human rights actors and civil society cannot rely solely on them because they exist to make profit, right? And this kind of content moderation that we're asking for is one that affects their bottom line. So as much as we want them to be accountable, there is space for us to do more in terms of educating those who are working on the algorithms, doing the content moderation to improve the way it works. Rapid response as well, when it relates to hate speech during crisis periods, is also something that's very important and very valuable that can combat this kind of information crisis. And lastly, on the platform side, I would say algorithm audits. The algorithms, you build them, you give them all this data, and they kind of run on autopilot. Every now and again, a human being needs to go there and see what is it repeating, what might be harmful in this algorithm, and how can we improve it. I don't think that happens often, if it happens at all. And there's also not much regulation in Africa that charges them to do this kind of specific audits of what eventually shows up on our screens. On the individual and community side, CCOB is very big on digital literacy. We have at least 2 practices whose entire focus is on digital literacy, digital security, training, capacity building for journalists, for media, for vulnerable groups. And now we're trying to move that or expand that into the kind of capacity building that puts safeguarding at the forefront, because that's also very important when you're dealing with people who are refugees, or will I say migrants, of different reasons as well. Fact-checking networks is also another strong suit that has been adopted across Africa. We've worked with one particular fact-checking organization in Central African Republic. I don't know if anybody is aware of the country, but it's a really small place in Central Africa, and internet is almost non-existent. But we have this group of journalists who have made it their work to scour Facebook and say, this information that's being passed is a lie, and here is why, right? Fact-checking networks are another way that we can combat information disorders on a community level. Organizations like the UNHCR, Paradigm, all of us represented on this panel, I imagine that we do a lot of work. We partner with CSOs and even individual media people to ensure that they are doing either investigative journalism work that improves narratives around refugees and displaced persons. We're doing this kind, CCOB in particular trains journalists year in, year out to improve their knowledge on how to spot fake news, harmful content as well. And it's, when we say harmful content, it's not always the graphic things that you see online. It's also narratives that plants a seed of discord in a community. When someone says that this group of people often do this, and that negative thing, or when you find people saying things like women, and this is why women shouldn't be in political offices, or this is why unmarried people should not hold setting, right? You have these narratives, and they're dressed up in very nice English, but when you drill down and that messaging gets to the wrong party, the next thing you find is someone is assuming that a person or a group or people from a particular group are the kinds of people that you should avoid, and you shouldn't give access to basic humanity. And I guess lastly, data protection is something that's really great gaining ground in Africa. Since the GDPR was enacted, we've seen a lot of African countries first copy the language of the legislation, and then after a few years they're like, oh, that doesn't really work for us. We don't have the infrastructure or even the know-how or the cultural consciousness to be able to protect data in this manner. So we've seen some countries going back and creating and submitting bills or even enacting laws and acts that are more culturally specific to their context. But the work, there's still a lot to be done in terms of that. And like I've also mentioned, there is a lot of education that has to go around, including displaced persons when it comes to data protection. Like Thobekile mentioned, registering for ID, registering for a SIM, getting financial inclusion as a refugee is still an area that has not been addressed by any legislation that exists around data protection in Africa. So that's an area, if someone was thinking, where should my advocacy be more firm on, that's an area that if you start that, I'm very sure there's a lot of people that want to learn about how to include these people when it comes to regulation. And I guess I'll just stop there now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wura. And I just to add, I think all of this is also happening at a time where we see a lot of these platforms regressing in terms of these policies very, very quickly, both in terms of policies and in terms of staffing. And so the challenges seem to be only growing, unfortunately. We had, if we could move to the next slide. I think you fell asleep. Okay. Well, so we had some questions that we had hoped to get your input on. But I think if we can just open up the floor to either questions for the panelists, or if you want to share experiences that you have, recommendations, I think we can kind of just put this all together. That's okay, as we're close to time. So maybe I'll just pass it.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question before I even do my presentation, because I was too much touched by the subject. It is speaking on refugee. And then my question is, who think in this room will not become a refugee the whole his life? If you are sure for that, you can raise a hand. If you are sure that I will never become a refugee in my life. I'm Nishishikari Johnson. I'm a refugee. I'm the secretary of refugee in Namibia. I'm also a chairperson of Osira Secondary School. Refugees are too much neglected and not even recognized in almost all African countries. Why? Because country that hosts refugee, they took a refugee community in deep corner where you can't access refugees. It's difficult to access refugees because if they've spoken about refugee and we don't see them even visiting, it's because it is costly to access refugees. And the question is, why you are going to accommodate someone and take him deep, somewhere where he cannot be accessed? Why? It's because many African countries are driven by self-hate, this xenophobic behavior. Because if we are not driven by self-hate, we should not do that to our fellow brothers and sisters. All of them that are speaking, they might be some who are native of Namibia, but I never saw them. And you need to know that I have been in Namibia 10 years. I'm not speaking something that I didn't see. I'm speaking something I'm living in. You are speaking on our behalf for their NGOs, organizations, and all of them you find them speaking on behalf of refugees, but we don't see them. Where are we? Deep somewhere to some kilometers. Even if you want to integrate these people in local community, no way. It becomes impossible. And check now. We already saw that everyone can become a refugee. What will happen to you the day you will become a refugee? One day. Because if you check, the world have turned around, many things are happening. I can even mention some, for example, a simple example. I saw Nicolas Sarkozy, ex-president of France, going in a prison. If he can get a way to escape, if he was not known, and become a refugee somewhere, can he not be happy? It's better to become a refugee somewhere than to be in a prison, in a closed area. Something can happen. But this consideration now is becoming more problematic to us, seriously to us. Refugee system is confused. Why? You heard about foreigners, refugees. Here I will request you to address us as we are. Call the dog by its name. Please, it's better. A person came, knocked to your door, declared himself, I'm ABCD. And then you received this person. And then you still call him names. I was surprised when I was talking to a UNHCR agent, said that, no, Johnson, this problem is not only in Namibia, all over in Africa. They don't call a refugee as a refugee. They call them names. Because when you say foreigners, it's both. He might be an illegal immigrant, and this allows you to treat this particular person as you want. And they refuse them everything. You can refuse them to all rights that exist, even the 5 basic needs in life. Why? Because he's a foreigner. But he is holding the document that came from your government. Those you accepted to be refugee in your country. They have documents from this particular country. When we go to look for services, then they'll be like, this foreigner. But I have checked the paper. It identifies me. Who am I? Who I am. I had a question. Tell me, my PhD and your PhD, what are the difference between the two? What is the difference between my PhD and your PhD in any career? Why? Because refugees are in refugee communities holding documents, but they don't have the right to work. Why? As a refugee representative, sometimes I go to sit in some interviews, giving work. When you reach a file for a refugee, they write on top, foreigner. And that one is closed immediately. You see? This is not this discrimination. A person who study in university, your university, not from even home, that one is another part. Let's talk a person who study in your country, born in your country, but because he's not having some identification, his file is turned down. With all these years studying, he will never use his document. And this is, I'm talking, if you want, I will tell you, on this particular day, I was in an interview with someone. What happened? I was not the one who interviewed him. I was an observer. Because of, I'm a refugee representative. And the bad part is, when it comes, when this is happening in that community of refugee. For example, a clinic, or a school that is inside the community of refugee. But you can't allow even the refugee to operate from there. That community that is deep down somewhere, to access them is very difficult. You can't even allow that person to operate in his community. No, see, wait. And then, refugee, we are not protected enough. We are not protected enough. Because if you push me here, push me there, push me everywhere, this is too much. It's too much. Maybe we can change. Now, today, this year or since last year, since Trump took over, UNHCR is very far a bit of refugee. We have got 2 people that are always close to refugee. Government that is hosting this refugee and UNHCR. Now, since there is no fund, UNHCR is not there. Now, who is with refugee? Say, who is with refugee? If you are not there, who is with them? And since the person who is hosting them is calling them name, who are these people? They become what? We are much concerned there. Then, I don't want to come back and raise a hand again. I better finish and then I give a chance to another person.
Thank you. I just want to give a statement for us to reflect on. Rebecca Nanono from Uganda. I'm a trainer in misinformation, disinformation, fact-checking. And last year, I noticed how governments have a big role to play in ending hate speech, both online and offline, especially towards refugee. We all know that Uganda is arguably the #1 refugee hosting country in Africa and #3 in the world. And last year, people online started talking about how there are so many refugees in the country. And as someone who is a trainer, I just realized I noticed how government was not doing proper communication. And I think that kind of communication is what they called development communication. Because government didn't even come out to respond to the people who are putting all these, I should call them negative sentiments online. Despite us people here who claim to be advocates on fact-checking, ending hate speech, we really need to acknowledge government's role in ending hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ngoy Wise. I am a refugee from DRC, Congo. I was interested by the speech of Madame Matimbe, apart from what the services that are online, even apart from the refugees. So I would like also to request to the governments, those who are on charge of the refugees, I don't know, in all the countries which are in Africa. So because we are limited, it's like a exit permit. For an example, for instance, if you are outside of the camp, you are maybe here in Windhoek, and there is maybe you are sick, and your exit permit is, your date of your exit permit is over. And you don't have to go back to Osire settlement. You are far, you are sick, and it's over. How will it be because you don't have to apply online the exit permit, and also apart from also work permit, we have a difficult because refugees, they don't have a work permit, and they are requested if there is an advertisement of the job, they are requested also to provide the work permit. Now, all those, I don't know, what are you planning? Because I can see the way that you were anyway giving detail and how things are working. What are you planning on that? Because we have difficulty. It's like the time of Corona, those refugees who were outside, who were far, and there was no movement, and there was no way to apply even work permit online. Because work permit is required to go back to Osir settlement, where in the camp, to Home Affairs, where you can collect it. You go there, you take your work permit. It's not allowed in to collect it, I don't know, or to apply it online. Now, I don't know, what are you planning on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your inputs and questions. Perhaps we can just run down the line if you would like to respond to any of the questions or provide any closing remarks, and then we can wrap up. Someone?
Right. I do agree with the sentiments about the role of the government when it comes to addressing harmful information about refugees. I think there is work that can be done from the UNHCR side in terms of engaging the refugee commissions in countries where you're present and you have individuals under the UNHCR's protection. I think that's one way to go about it. There's also the role of advocacy from media and the CSOs that can be done whenever we have offshoots of that kind of harmful content online. I don't think there is one person or one organization that has the responsibility to shut down those kind of comments per time. But I do believe that there is space for government to find a way to do the same way they release statements when hate speech is directed towards them. There's nothing wrong with releasing a statement to say that this kind of narrative is harmful. We want to create an environment where people feel welcome or at least seen or human just by virtue of their status in the country. So that's one way to look at it. And to address your questions about how, I think your question was particularly about if you've been admitted as a refugee to certain countries, you're usually relegated to a specific area and you need a permit to leave. And in some cases, when you've left, you can't come back within the timeline that the permit allows you to be out of camp. And there is no other way to request an extended time until you're back in camp. And sometimes law enforcement might meet you while that is happening. Personally, I may not be able to give you an answer, but it's feedback that can be taken back to the organizations that directly work with refugees. And I believe that there is space for exits to be renewable without direct contact with whoever issued it in the first place. That's something that can be worked on. And in terms of automation, it's a long road. But like I said, we do, we have an affinity to the questions that you've raised. While we may not be able to provide direct solutions now, I do believe that our advocacy can include that kind of information after here?
Thank you so much for your question, and I think my response is that digital exclusion has adverse impacts on fundamental rights and freedoms. It's granted, whether it's in the healthcare sector for refugees, it's in the sector of the labor market, it's in the sector of education, it's just a mess. And I think for us as an organization, our part is to promote digital inclusion for marginalized groups, and I think there's perpetuation of marginalization by not affording meaningful connectivity for refugees, and that in itself is a major concern for us. So we'll continue to advocate, at least from our end. That's our, our at least input into the solution, so to speak. And hopefully that this is going to improve its continuous engagement with governments. It's also, I think, the role of national human rights institutions also to literally prioritize this as a major concern. Without, bridging that digital divide, in the context of refugees, allowing them to be able to be meaningfully connected, whether they're in the most remote of our countries, without actually addressing that problem, I think we'll continue to have, perpetuated, harm for refugees. So you raise a very important aspect, and I think it touches on also what you, the gentleman in the front, was mentioning around what's going to happen if there's no funding, what is going to happen. But I think what we need is to advocate for policies and legislative frameworks that ensure that refugees are not treated as criminals, but they are given access, to services through the relevant legislative frameworks that are developed. Also a victim-centered approach, which I mentioned. I think there's importance in actually ensuring that whatever I can see you're loaded, you've got a lot of content and experience in terms of the situations that you're facing, centering those voices and your experience even would be able to strengthen advocacy engagements that are that have been taken by civil society organizations. So it's important that you continue to speak and share your insights with the relevant organizations that are doing this advocacy, and also be able to be in the room as well, engaging with policymakers, because it's important for changing the legislative ecosystem.
Thank you so much. And I think I'll speak to or address the issue of concepts and connotations behind concepts. Foreign nationals, refugees, and I think we all have a role to play in driving the narrative and in addressing issues of anti-foreigner sentiments and narratives, and also making sure that in the space of digital rights that young people have access to digital rights or understand their digital rights. And I think at the center is the young person, and the role of government in making sure that, whether through statements or policy reform, that there are policies that are able to advance our children's digital rights, young people's digital rights, whether it's refugees or South African in South Africa or wherever you are, right? In South Africa, we have this tendency of the government saying in the constitution that the land is for whoever resides in it, and then be quiet when refugees don't have access to medical services or educational services or any kind of services in the country, right? And so we need that to stop, and that is ridiculous. But in terms of digital rights, at the center again is the young person, the role of journalists and media in driving the narrative and changing the narrative. In South Africa, we have this thing of when crime has happened, we'll say foreign national found, a foreign. Why does it have to be a foreign national? It could just be a guy was found, a criminal was found. It doesn't have to be a foreign national. That title in newspaper, front of a newspaper, doesn't have to be there, because that drives narrative and it creates tension in the words we say and what we mean by the words we say. Again, the role of civil society, government, and tech is to be able to promote media information literacy, advanced media information literacy for all children, and the role particularly of platforms is to not just prevent digital harms, but also promote content, public service content, educational content, content that raises awareness about differences and others, and so that we can then be able to advance digital rights for everyone.
Very briefly, I think the role of government is important, and what you're currently doing is giving them data that they can use to hold tech companies accountable, because tech companies say we are cleaning social media, refugees are not being attacked, but then we have the data to prove whether it's working or not. So that's the first one. And then on your point, this idea of like, yeah, refugees being relegated into like very remote regions in a country, yes, something we've seen. And one of the things that we're currently thinking of is like, how can they still participate and raise their voices to change that? And that's the way we think of deliberative technologies that allow them to be in the conversation, not just participants or like victims of the results, but be able to raise their voices, center their agency into those conversations and say, we want to be more central, we want to be more involved. Thank you.
Just very briefly, we know there's obviously a lot of work to be done, both in this space and outside of the digital, the world as well. But there's a lot of great things happening. We're learning, we're piloting things, we're testing things, we're taking those back and trying again, and we will continue to do so. So first, thank you very much to our panelists. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us, and to all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us today, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.